For 82 years, the dirt beneath Arthur Vance's boots was the only constant in a world that wouldn't stop changing. His hands were leather, his spine was slightly curved from a lifetime of pulling calves from frozen mud, and his mind was a steel trap of local history. So, when the sleek, black luxury SUVs tore down his gravel driveway, kicking up a blinding cloud of white dust, Arthur didn't blink. He just leaned against his cedar fence post, watched the suits step out onto his grass, and waited. They thought they were looking at a helpless old man. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. The Blackwood Valley had belonged to the Vance family since 1874. It wasn't just land, it was an archive of survival. But to Vanguard Development Group, it was nothing more than an annoying blank space on a map, a crucial plot of acreage needed to complete a multi-million-dollar luxury resort and golf course. The corporate entity had systematically bought up every surrounding property, turning a once vibrant ranching community into a ghost town of impending construction. Arthur was the final holdout. He had refused their initial offers, ignored their certified letters, and hung up on their high-powered attorneys. But corporations like Vanguard don't take no for an answer. They don't just ask, they take. It started with subtle pressures. Arthur's water rights were suddenly challenged by the county board, an administrative hurdle clearly funded by outside interests. Then, the local supply store mysteriously stopped extending him credit for winter feed. But the true escalation came on that Tuesday afternoon when a man named Marcus Vance, no relation, though the shared surname felt like a cruel cosmic joke, stepped out of the lead SUV. Marcus was Vanguard's chief legal hatchet man, a guy who specialized in finding the structural fractures in people's lives and driving a wedge straight through them. Marcus didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he snapped open a sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents bearing the official gold seal of the state circuit court. It was an eviction notice, backed by an emergency eminent domain filing. The justification was a masterclass in bureaucratic corruption. The county was claiming the land was public domain due to an unrecorded deed transfer dating back to the Great Depression. According to the state's modern digital database, Arthur's grandfather had technically forfeited the property titles during a tax dispute in 1932. The subsequent decades of Vance occupancy were being legally classified as a multi-generational squatted tenancy. You have exactly 21 days to clear the livestock and vacate the structures, Mr. Vance, Marcus said, his voice flat, sterile, and entirely devoid of human empathy. The county has already approved the zoning variance. If you aren't gone by the 21st day, state marshals will remove you and seize the remaining property. Arthur didn't rage. He didn't yell, and he didn't reach for the rifle resting in the window rack of his old Ford tractor. He took the papers, his rough thumb leaving a smudge of tractor grease on the pristine white bond paper. He looked Marcus dead in the eye, a gaze hardened by decades of facing down mountain lions and brutal blizzards. My grandfather paid every dime he owed this county, Arthur said softly, his voice like grinding stones. And this dirt remembers. Marcus chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. The dirt doesn't hold a legal title, Arthur. The digital database does. And right now, the database says you don't exist. The SUVs rolled away, leaving Arthur alone in the quiet valley as the sun dipped below the jagged edge of the western ridges. The weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. He walked into his kitchen, the floorboards creaking familiar songs under his boots. He sat at the oak table, staring at the eviction notice under the dim light of a single bulb. He knew the local lawyers wouldn't help him. Vanguard had already retained the town's only legal firm to prevent a conflict of interest. The courthouse records from the 1930s had conveniently been lost in a basement flood 10 years prior. Every conventional avenue of defense was completely blocked. Arthur looked out the window toward the northern ridge of his property, where a grove of ancient white oak stood like silent sentinels against the darkening sky. Up there, hidden from the main road, lay the old family cemetery. It was a place he hadn't visited since his wife, Sarah, had passed away 5 years ago. Suddenly, an old memory flashed through his mind, a story his grandfather used to tell him by the fireplace when Arthur was just a boy. It was a story about the winter of 1932, a desperate deal, and an eccentric county clerk who hated corporations even more than he hated the winter cold. Arthur grabbed his heavy canvas coat and a powerful flashlight. His knees standardly protested the sudden movement, but a newfound adrenaline surged through his veins. He didn't know if the physical evidence still existed, or if time and weather had erased the truth entirely. But as he stepped out into the freezing night air, heading toward the dark silhouette of the oak grove, he knew this was his only shot. He was going to look for a historical anomaly that the digital databases completely forgot to log. The beam of Arthur's flashlight cut through the heavy darkness of the northern ridge, illuminating the gnarled roots of the ancient white oaks. The air up here was colder, carrying the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. This plot of high ground was the oldest section of the ranch, a square acre consecrated by his ancestors before the town below even had a name. He stepped through the rusted iron gate, its hinges groaning against the silence of the night. He wasn't looking at the modern granite headstones of his parents or his beloved Sarah. Instead, he bypassed them entirely, wading deeper into the overgrown weeds toward the back boundary wall where the oldest markers lay. Here, the headstones weren't made of polished marble. They were rough-hewn slabs of local fieldstone, their inscriptions deeply weathered by a century of brutal winters and scorching summers. Arthur knelt in the dirt, his flashlight illuminating the faint, hand-carved lettering on a stone that marked the resting place of Jedediah Vance, his great-uncle who died during the influenza outbreak of 1918. Right beside Jedediah's marker was a smaller, moss-covered stone that technically shouldn't have been there based on the county's official land maps. To the uneducated eye, it looked like a simple footstone. But Arthur remembered his grandfather's specific words, "When the bankers come with ink, you look to the stones that hold the iron." Arthur pulled a heavy hunting knife from his belt and used the pommel to gently tap the top of the mossy stone. Instead of the dull, flat thud of solid limestone, a distinct, metallic ring echoed through the quiet grove. He scraped away decades of creeping moss and packed dirt, revealing a thick, rectangular iron plate bolted directly into the stone's base. It was a historic surveyor's marker, a permanent benchmark used by late 19th century land cartographers to establish legal boundaries before modern gridding systems took over. But it wasn't just a marker. Engraved directly into the rusted iron plate was a sequence of filing numbers and a specific legal term, ecclesiastical grant sanctuary. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. In the early history of the territory, long before the state circuit court had centralized authority, land grants were often intertwined with religious parishes and community burial grounds. Under the old territorial charter of 1882, any land officially designated as a multi-denominational community cemetery was legally classified as sovereign communal property. Crucially, the charter explicitly stated that cemetery boundaries extended outward by a radius of exactly 1,000 yards from the outermost interred remains to prevent industrial encroachment from disturbing the dead. If this iron marker was legally valid, the 1,000-yard radius didn't just protect the cemetery itself, it blanketed the entire valley floor, including Arthur's ranch house, his barns, and the exact acreage Vanguard Development Group intended to bulldoze for their luxury resort. The corporate lawyers had based their entire eviction strategy on a 1932 digital tax forfeiture record. They assumed the land was simple agricultural property subject to standard eminent domain laws. They completely overlooked the fact that the land wasn't standard property at all. It was an unalienable historical sanctuary. But Arthur knew that having a rusted iron plate in the dirt wasn't enough to stop a multi-million-dollar legal team. He needed the original ledger, the physical document that proved this specific marker was officially filed and recognized by the territorial government before the county database ever existed. The next morning, Arthur didn't go to the county courthouse. He knew Vanguard's influence ran deep through those halls. Instead, he drove his old Ford pickup truck 30 miles north to the State Historical Archives located in the basement of an old university library. The archivist, a quiet woman named Eleanor with thick glasses and a passion for forgotten regional history, looked skeptical when Arthur explained what he was searching for. Territorial cemetery ledgers from the late 1800s are incredibly rare, Mr. Vance. Eleanor explained, her fingers flying across her keyboard. Most of those records were digitized in the early 2000s, and if they weren't scanned, they were usually destroyed or lost during the regional consolidation of '96. Check the private collections, Arthur urged, leaning over the counter. Look for the journals of Thomas Sterling. He was the circuit clerk in 1932. When the county tried to remap the valley during the Depression to help the banks foreclosing on families, Thomas refused to hand over his original leather ledgers. He said the modern system was built on theft. Eleanor paused, her eyes narrowing with interest. She clicked through a series of restricted archival directories. 10 minutes of tense silence passed, broken only by the hum of the basement's ventilation system. Suddenly, her monitor flashed with a location code corresponding to a deep storage vault in the facility's lowest subbasement. It says here that Sterling's personal estate donated 3 uncatalogued crates of personal papers in 1974, Eleanor whispered, a look of genuine wonder crossing her face. They were flagged as administrative duplicates and never opened for public viewing. Let's go find out what Thomas Sterling was hiding. Down in the climate-controlled vaults, surrounded by the smell of aging paper and leather, Eleanor carefully pulled a heavy, dust-covered wooden crate from the bottom shelf. Arthur watched with bated breath as she pried open the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed wax paper, lay a massive, leather-bound ledger with reinforced brass corners. The spine read, Territorial Parish Registries and Burial Plots, District 4. Eleanor put on white cotton archival gloves and gently opened the ledger. The pages were filled with beautiful, sweeping calligraphy written in faded iron gall ink. As she turned to the section marked Blackwood Valley, Arthur's eyes immediately locked onto a hand-drawn map. There, precisely detailed in faded black ink, was the layout of his family's ridge. And right at the boundary line, the clerk had drawn a tiny, detailed sketch of a headstone with an iron plate. Beneath the drawing, written in Thomas Sterling's bold handwriting dated November 14, 1932, was a notation that changed everything. Vanguard Group's predecessor attempted to claim tax default on the Vance homestead today. I have formally executed the 1882 Territorial Sanctuary Clause. The dead protect the living. This valley cannot be sold, subdivided, or seized by any corporate or state entity so long as the iron marker stands. With a certified, high-resolution copy of Thomas Sterling's 1932 ledger tucked securely inside a heavy envelope, Arthur walked out of the State Archive Library into the blinding afternoon sun. For the first time in weeks, the crushing weight on his chest had lifted, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He knew that simply mailing these documents to Vanguard Development Group would give their high-priced legal team time to find a loophole, bribe a county official, or tie the matter up in appellate courts until Arthur passed away from old age. He needed to strike when they least expected it, using their own momentum against them. The 21-day eviction clock was ticking down rapidly. Instead of hiding away on his ranch or trying to negotiate a settlement, Arthur stayed completely silent, letting Vanguard believe they had won an easy victory. He watched from his porch over the next 2 weeks as the development company moved heavy earth-moving equipment, yellow bulldozers, and massive excavators to the very edge of his property line. They were preparing to break ground the exact minute the eviction notice became legally enforceable. On the morning of the 21st day, the valley air was crisp and biting. A convoy of luxury vehicles arrived at the ranch gate. Led by Marcus Vance and a security detail, accompanied by 2 county sheriff's vehicles tasked with enforcing the state marshal's eviction order. Behind them followed a flatbed truck carrying a temporary chain-link fence meant to cordon off the property. Marcus stepped out of his car, adjusting his designer sunglasses, a smug grin plastered across his face. He expected to find a broken old man packing boxes into a rusted pickup truck. Instead, he found Arthur Vance sitting comfortably in a lawn chair directly in the center of the gravel driveway, blocking the path of the lead bulldozer. "Mr. Vance, your time is up," Marcus called out, stepping forward with the sheriff close behind him. "The eviction order is now active. If you do not step aside immediately, the sheriff will be forced to arrest you for criminal trespass on corporate property, and your remaining livestock will be impounded at your expense. Don't make this difficult." Arthur didn't stand up. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the heavy manila envelope, and tossed it onto the hood of Marcus's pristine black SUV. "I'm not trespassing on your property, Marcus," Arthur said calmly, crossing his boots. "You're currently trying to authorize an industrial trespass on a state-protected sovereign sanctuary. I suggest you open that package before your driver starts up that bulldozer, because the moment that blade touches my dirt, you personally commit a Class 1 corporate felony under state territorial law." Marcus sneered, but the presence of the county sheriff, who was bound by law to review any unexpected title evidence presented on site, forced his hand. Marcus snapped open the envelope, pulling out the certified copies of the 1882 Territorial Parish Registry and Thomas Sterling's handwritten 1932 ledger notes. As his eyes scanned the sweeping calligraphy and the official state archival seal, the smug grin completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, pale emptiness. "What is this garbage?" Marcus stammered, though his voice lacked its previous venom. "This is a century-old notebook. It has no relevance. The modern digital database completely supersedes any unindexed regional paperwork." The county sheriff stepped forward, taking the documents from Marcus's shaking hands. Unlike the corporate lawyer, the sheriff knew local history, and he recognized the official gold-embossed stamp of the State Historical Archive. More importantly, he saw the legal citation, Ecclesiastical Grant Sanctuary, Charter 1882. "Hold on a minute, Marcus," the sheriff said, his face hardening as he looked at the developer. "If this iron marker described in this ledger is still physically present on this ridge, this isn't standard agricultural land. Territorial sanctuary charters were grandfathered into our state constitution during the 1912 unification. They can't be dissolved by an eminent domain filing, because the state never actually owned the underlying title to begin with. The title belongs exclusively to the descendants of the parish." "It's a trick," Marcus shouted, turning on Arthur. "There is no iron marker. He's making it up to stall the project. We have millions of dollars of investor capital tied up in this groundbreaking today." Arthur slowly stood up from his lawn chair, pointing his calloused finger toward the northern ridge where the ancient white oaks stood. "The marker is exactly where Thomas Sterling recorded it 94 years ago," Arthur said, his voice echoing across the silent valley. "It's bolted into the bedrock at the base of the boundary headstone. And according to the territorial charter, the sanctuary protections extend exactly 1,000 yards in a perfect circle from that stone. That circle covers every single square inch of this ranch, and it cuts directly through the northern half of your proposed golf course." The sheriff looked at Marcus, then back at Arthur. "We're going up to that ridge right now to verify the physical evidence. Driver, turn off that bulldozer engine. Nobody moves a single spoonful of dirt until I see that stone." The entire convoy, the lawyers, the sheriffs, and Arthur, marched up the winding path to the old family cemetery. Marcus was sweating through his expensive suit, his eyes darting around the overgrown brush, desperately praying that time, erosion, or rust had destroyed the marker. But as they entered the iron gate and stepped into the shade of the ancient oaks, there it was. Arthur had cleaned away every speck of dirt and moss, leaving the thick, rectangular iron plate fully exposed to the daylight. The engraved words Ecclesiastical Grant Sanctuary were completely legible, the heavy iron bolts anchoring it immovably to the mountain bedrock. The sheriff took out his phone, captured high-resolution photographs of the iron plate, and compared them directly to the map drawings in the 1932 ledger. The match was absolutely flawless. He turned to Marcus, his expression deadpan. "Order your crews to pack up their equipment and move it back to the highway, Marcus," the sheriff commanded. "This eviction is officially stayed pending a state Supreme Court title review. And if I see a single one of your bulldozers cross this fence line before then, I'll put you in handcuffs myself." The immediate victory on the ridge felt monumental, but Arthur knew that a cornered beast is always the most dangerous. Vanguard Development Group didn't just have millions of dollars on the line, they had their entire corporate reputation staked on the Blackwood Valley luxury resort. By nightfall, the bulldozers had retreated past the highway, but the heavy, oppressive silence that settled over the ranch didn't feel like peace. It felt like the tense, breathless pause before a second strike. Arthur sat by his kitchen window, his rifle resting across his knees, watching the distant flickering headlights of unmarked cars patrolling the perimeter of his property line. They weren't breaking the law by driving on a public road, but the psychological message was crystal clear: we are watching, and we are not done. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came at precisely 3 a.m. A sudden, violent spike in the valley's power grid blew out the transformer on Arthur's property, plunging the entire ranch into pitch-black darkness. Simultaneously, the cellular service on his old flip phone completely died, a total signal blackout that felt far too coordinated to be an accident. But the real blow didn't happen on the ranch. It happened 30 miles north, at the State Historical Archives. The very next morning, a pale, trembling Eleanor called Arthur from a borrowed landline. Her voice was frantic, laced with a level of fear that made Arthur's blood run cold. "Arthur, it's gone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Someone broke into the deep storage vault last night. They bypassed the facility's security matrix, wiped the digital access logs for the sub-basement floors, and went straight for the Thomas Sterling collection. The wooden crate is still there, but the 1882 leather ledger, the physical book with the map and the handwritten sanctuary notation, it's completely missing." Arthur's hand gripped the receiver until his knuckles turned white. "What about the certified copies you made for me, Eleanor? The ones with the official archival seal?" "They're legally valid for a temporary stay," Eleanor stammered, "but Vanguard's appellate attorneys have already filed an emergency motion with the state Supreme Court demanding the production of the original physical document for forensic ink testing. They are claiming our copies are sophisticated, digitally manipulated forgeries. If we can't produce the actual physical ledger in front of the High Court judge in exactly 48 hours, the temporary stay will automatically dissolve. The eviction will be reinstated, and the bulldozers will roll over your house before sunset." The trap had snapped shut with terrifying speed. Vanguard hadn't tried to fight the law, they had simply erased the evidence of the law. Without the original 1882 ledger to prove the authenticity of the iron marker, Arthur's certified copies were nothing more than useless pieces of paper in the eyes of a strict, bureaucratic Supreme Court panel. But as Arthur stared out at the sprawling valley, a sharp, cold realization began to take shape in his mind. The thieves had been incredibly meticulous, but they had made one catastrophic, arrogant assumption. They assumed that Thomas Sterling had only written the truth down once. They assumed that the leather ledger in the archive vault was the only record of the 1882 sanctuary charter. Arthur remembered another detail from his grandfather's fireside stories, a detail that hadn't been written in the archival files. When Thomas Sterling hid the records from the corrupt banking cartels in 1932, he didn't trust the county vaults, and he didn't entirely trust the state archives either. He was a man obsessed with redundancies. According to family lore, Sterling had constructed a secondary, secret repository right inside the Blackwood Valley, a place where the corporate lawyers would never dare to look, because looking there would require them to break the most sacred taboo in the entire county. But finding that secondary record meant Arthur had to solve a cryptic riddle left behind by a dead clerk, and he had less than 2 days to do it. The clues were rumored to be hidden somewhere within the oldest, unmapped graves of the cemetery itself, coded into the very names and dates of the people buried beneath the dirt. To make matters worse, as Arthur stepped onto his porch to head back up the ridge, he saw a team of private security contractors hired by Vanguard setting up a high-tech surveillance tripod right at the edge of his fence line. They were using thermal imaging cameras and long-range directional microphones to track his every single move. If he went back up to the cemetery and started searching the headstones, the corporate operators would see exactly what he was doing, figure out his plan, and intervene before he could find the backup files. He had to play a high-stakes game of psychological misdirection in broad daylight, under the watchful eyes of high-tech corporate spies, while the clock ticked down the final hours of his family's legacy. Arthur didn't let the thermal cameras see his panic. Instead, he utilized their own surveillance against them. He spent the entire afternoon conspicuously digging a massive, completely meaningless hole near his western barn, drawing the private security team's focus entirely away from the northern ridge. As night fell and a thick valley fog rolled in, completely blinding their thermal optics, Arthur slipped out of a hidden cellar door and crawled through the brush back up to the old cemetery. He didn't search the headstones. He went straight to the old iron marker itself. He realized Thomas Sterling's riddle wasn't about the names on the graves, it was about the weight of the stone. Arthur unscrewed the rusted iron plate from the bedrock, revealing a hollow vertical chamber drilled deep into the stone's base. Inside, protected by a waterproof zinc cylinder, lay the ultimate contingency, the original 1882 territorial charter duplicate, signed not just by the clerk, but by the first governor of the state. The next morning, Arthur walked into the state Supreme Court unannounced, flanked by a phalanx of regional news reporters he had tipped off. When Vanguard's lawyers confidently claimed the original archive record didn't exist, Arthur laid the zinc cylinder directly onto the judge's bench. The pristine, governor-signed charter was indisputable. The Supreme Court issued a permanent, non-appealable injunction against Vanguard Development Group. The ranch was saved, the sanctuary status was codified into modern law, and the bulldozers were ordered to leave the Blackwood Valley forever. The screen suddenly cuts from the sweeping drone shots of the beautiful, protected valley to a stark, high-contrast black-and-white image of a completely different, abandoned farmhouse covered in corporate warning signs. Arthur Vance fought the system and won because his ancestors left him a roadmap in the dirt. But right now, across the country, thousands of historical homesteads are disappearing off the map entirely because of a single, hidden loophole in modern digital deed registries, one that might actually apply to the land your house is built on right now without you even knowing it. If you want to discover how corporate developers use digital database erasures to quietly rewrite property lines in your state, drop a comment below with the word history, and I will reply with the exact public archive search tools you can use to protect your own family's heritage. Stories like Arthur's prove that the past isn't just something we leave behind, it's the only armor we have against a future that wants to erase us. If you believe that a person's heritage is worth more than a corporate profit margin, smash that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. By doing that, you help independent storytelling survive against the algorithms that try to bury these truths. And if you want to see another mind-blowing story where a single forgotten historical document completely brought down a corrupt multi-billion-dollar empire, click right here on the video showing on your screen right now. Watch it immediately, because just like Arthur's ledger, you never know how long it will stay online. See you there.